It's a wonderful morning on NTV because my guests this morning had a very good sporting weekend. I am joined by Francis Muhire, who's an economist, here to have this conversation with us in our Kickstarter, which is about structure of economic quagmire in Uganda's debt. I'm also joined by Richard Ayesigwa, who's also an economist. But allow me to first dig into the sporting weekends. You've been here, so our new guest here, Richard, good morning to you.
Good morning.
How was your sporting weekend?
It went well.
Which team do you support?
I support Manchester United.
All right.
Yeah, and we are having a great season.
All right.
I might say compared to what we had anticipated previously. And I think to all the supporters, it's not only me. We expected the worst, actually, for this season, but from the way things are going, I can't complain.
Okay, Francis, how was your sporting weekend?
The weekend was really great. F1 fan, especially Mercedes AMG racing team. So we saw for the first time this season you had a very bad car, but for the first time you saw Mercedes, winning the race. That's the Brazilian taking the first and the second pole. Yeah. So it was really interesting.
Okay, well, in the very same weekend they're talking about, it's been other things that are happening, especially as far as Uganda's debt is concerned. Now, during last week's evening days, the Ministry of Finance highlighted on the status of Uganda's debt and borrowing economy that indicated a suffocation for external borrowing, exponential increase in domestic debt to 39%, approximately 39 trillion shillings in the concluded financial year. In addition, the Ministry of ICT had to defend a 500 billion shilling loan request for digital infrastructure. We also saw that. What is the status of the nation's economy and growing debt, and of course more borrowing? And these gentlemen are here to illuminate this conversation for us. I'll start with you, Francis. So let's first get a clear picture of the current status of the economy, the debt and the continuous borrowing as per the concluded financial quarter.
Thank you, Priscilla. That is a very, very interesting question, and this should actually worry every Ugandan. So, but I'll start by saying that debt is not a bad thing itself. All countries, have debts, but the question has always been, how do you use this debt? How do you use the borrowed resources? So when you look at Uganda today, as we speak today, and look at our debt stock, we are talking about 80 trillion Ugandan shillings. And we've seen the debt increasing by over 20% just in the space of 3 years, from 2019 up to then. So it is really very worrying. And while we've always been talking about the debt, for me, I would like us even actually to put the debate about, two things: debt and corruption. These are the two things that are actually progressively increasing in this country, and that's where we should be looking at. So the debt is really worrying. When you look at 80 trillion Ugandan shillings, the debt as we speak today, and the government is not going to stop borrowing today. More loan applications are everywhere, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, any source. Even the government is saying is going private. So very soon they're even going to be, getting funds from the private, lenders. So the picture is really worrying. And it has been worrying, but it's getting worse. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, Francis has moved a motion to move the debate from what we're talking about to debt versus corruption. What would you say about debt versus corruption, Richard?
Yeah, I would say that probably one of the issues that is affecting the debt and the corruption, one is when we acquire these debts. When we are acquiring the debts, sometimes there are no stringent rules on how this money should be utilized. And I think that is why in most cases we find
there are no stringent rules, or the ones that exist are not enough?
Some of them, like the bilaterals, if you borrow from China per se, the money you want is what they will give you without any conditions. For them, what they want is paying back. It's like you have gone to a private money borrower whom you say, I want 1 million, and he says the interest rate is 20%, this is the money. And that is why probably government consistently started moving from acquiring debts from like IMF, World Bank, because such debt would come with stringent rules. If you are to implement the timelines, the reporting, it's as if you have actually gotten, like you have written a proposal and gotten a grant. So they want to know how you utilize this money. But when you find that they are acquiring monies without any stringent rules on how they will utilize it, or they are not accountable to anyone, so the way they use the money is up to their own discretion. And in the end, there is bound to be leakages and misuse.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about the country's external debt to GDP ceiling being really suppressed. The government seems to, from recent past, shifting the budget from development to domestic channels. In the papers this morning, we are seeing Ministry of Finance calling to domestic channels to be able to help them fund the financial year budget 2022-2023. So clearly, give us a perspective as to why Uganda is taking this course of action now.
First of all, like we saw this year's financial budget, it was indicated that actually over 7.1 trillion shilling was going to come from the domestic market. So the government has realized that the external debt, you know, you might get it at a low cost in terms of interest rate, but the strings attached to this loan are really very, very, immense, and the effects are really very devastating. Because most of these external loans, besides 20% being owned by the Chinese, but you have other debts that are coming from, Europe, coming from Western countries. Now, some of these conditions are very devastating to the extent that they will give you a loan, but they will tell you how to use or how to allocate, even in the areas. So they will judge where you should actually allocate your resources, though they will not ask for accountability. That is yours. So the government has realized that the strings attached to these loans are actually very, very immense, and that's why they are trying now to go to the domestic. But borrowing from the domestic, already we have a struggling, domestic economy. You have the private sector, which is already being suffocated. You have COVID-19, which has really put too much burden on the private sector. The government itself, it's not that it's going to start borrowing from the domestic market, has been doing that, but is now going to increase the level it has been borrowing from it. So it is an indication to all the financial players, the creditors in the domestic market, that do not lend the private sector, I need this money. So that was the signal from the start that, for example, put over 7.1 trillion shillings aside, I'm coming for it. And, it's very worrying. I was actually discussing with some people that when you're talking about the debt, there are those effects of debt that actually you can kill your own economy, you can kill your own private sector when you start borrow from the domestic market. I'll give you this scenario. When you look at the government treasury bonds, let's say the one of 10 years, interest rate attached, it is about 12%, and it's going actually to increase. If I'm an investor, any rational investor, I will not invest, let's say, establish a factory that will provide jobs, and at the end of the day, I will actually pay 30% in form of corporate tax. Instead, I will put my money in the government securities, go to the Bahamas, and I wait. My money will make my money. There is no risk involved. Yeah. So this appetite for the government to borrow from the domestic market is killing the private sector. Not that is increasing the general interest rate or the lending rate in the market, but also it is encouraging foreign investors, both local and foreign, to invest in government securities rather than other productive activities like manufacturing.
Okay, Richard, this causes a question of is it viable to rely on domestic debts? But as you give us, your perspective into that, from Muhire's submission, what I get to see is that IMF with all its strict terms and conditions for you to get the money that they give you, they do it out of a good heart and the protection of both involved parties. You get to then have China, the government of China, coming through because so many nations have failed to adhere to IMF, and therefore you do have other money pools that have created an environment whereby you don't have to go through that many rules, you don't have to go through that many terms and conditions to attain money. Here we can give you the money, use it for whatever you use it, and give it to us. And so that in a way is causing trouble or a loophole in terms of debt servicing and debt gaining and repaying back for the countries that are on the receiving end, because it's weakening their commitment and hence opening up places for corruption that he talked about.
Yeah, what you're talking about is true. However, when you do not want to be probably sanctioned, or if you do not want to adhere to some of these rules, sometimes you have something to hide. Because in most cases, it's not like IMF is giving you money to cripple you down and make sure you don't utilize the money. But then probably the challenge could be the capacity to utilize the money, the capacity to implement, probably adhering the timelines of implementing these projects. But I do not think that in their own designing these financial aids and putting together this money, their interest is to fail,
to suffocate,
or suffocate the whole system, or to put the money there and no one can use it. But the challenge is that, like you see here in the private sector, if you want money and you want to go to the bank, there is a lot of stringent rules attached to it, and also the process of getting that money. You might end up taking probably 6 months to access a loan in the bank. While if you go to a private money lender, you go today and you come back with the money. So you find also the government probably has such interests. It wants money now. It is probably, it's an election period, and money is needed as soon as possible. So going through the whole process of requesting and approving money from the IMF might take a whole lot of time, which they might not have. But also the way you use the money, if someone wanted to take away a certain chunk of the money, like where he has talked about corruption, they know they will not be able to do that. And actually there are instances where they have said money has come, and because of the stringent rules attached to it on how you utilize it, it has remained seated in the Bank of Uganda, and utilized and accumulating interest on it. So
is it viable for the government to actually depend on the domestic debt?
I would say no, it is not viable. First of all, he has talked about what is happening to our economy currently, and actually the deputy governor, Bank of Uganda, predicted that we might be going into a recession, and the economy is not about to recover until probably 2015, 2016. And so what does that mean? That if the economy is doing badly, and you are even, and government mainly, Uganda mainly will depend on the private sector, and you want to suffocate the private sector out. Because if government is saying we are borrowing from the private sector, what does that mean? Sorry, what does that mean for different businesses? There is less risk related to borrowing, giving money to government, as opposed to giving it to the private sector. And with the bad economy already, the economy is struggling, there are a lot of non-performing loans, and banks can actually expect more, given the prediction. So which means that banks will not be willing to give money to the private sector. So what happens to it? It is suffocated out. The businesses, different businesses will continue to collapse as a result of government taking money from the economy, because every money lender, every bank is willing and actually looking to give money to the government, because it is associated with less risks, less running costs of maintenance and following up. You do not have to run after government to pay you back, as opposed to the different businesses. So it gives running from the economy, running from the private economy is not a good thing, and also probably the amount they are taking, they should probably put a cap and reduce it, so at least there is something left for the other
Richard,
players.
you also mentioned something. You said that unless someone is trying to hide something. What did you mean by that statement in regards to this conversation?
Please tell us.
Yeah, so what I'm meaning is that if you have nothing to hide, what I'm meaning by something to hide is that you want to use the money to divert the money for different things. For example, you can give an example of the money that the government sends the districts. There is money that is conditioned. It is a conditional grant, that it will only be used for the purpose for which it has been sent to these districts. And diverting that money to something else, even if it was probably a classroom block that has collapsed, or a hospital say it needs a toilet, and they can't even divert that money to what? To give a toilet to a health center, which is also an important thing. So that is the same thing, that if this money comes and it is conditioned, and you know you can only use it probably for your web, to empower women. And for you, in actual sense, you wanted to construct a road or do any other thing, and you can't do it. So they end up running away from it. And sometimes the projects that they want to construct are the projects that end up siphoning money, that have leakages. So that's where corruption breeds from, because the money you have received the money, and the terms of use are open. So it is easy for you to divert it into different ventures that are even not developmental to the nation.
Okay, all right. Muhire, there's some people who are wondering, what's the actual picture of our debt structure that we have right now, especially towards domestic, but also foreign?
Okay, thank you. Before I go to that, I want to say more about the strings that are attached to these external loans. We tend to look at more on the quantitative side, looking at the interest and all these things. But we need to look at the qualitative side, the strings attached. The cost is really high, and I want to tell you that, for example, when you hear these, for example, Western countries saying there's no democracy, human rights, you have to live like this, even you need to accept, let's say, homosexuality and all those things. All these things are part of the strings attached to this kind of loans. But also, remember, when you pay this external debt, you have to pay it in foreign currencies, and most especially the USA dollar. So the government, and you've seen our local currencies depreciating, our exports are not doing well, tourism has been down, so meaning that we've not been earning enough, our foreign currency reserves, to the extent that even we had to get our special drawing rights from IMF. So the government is going to domestic, because for domestic, our creditors, you can pay them using your local currency. Even if it means printing, though it is not the best solution, but you can go ahead and do that, though it has its own issues. But to go back to your question, this whole picture of debt in Uganda, whether it's external, whether it's domestic, it has its repercussions. And as I said, the debt itself wouldn't be having a problem. But the effects of having this appetite. And remember, the debt, if let's say you make debt or borrowing as your main source of revenue as a government, itself is addictive. That's why when we look at this financial year's budget, over 42% of funding for our budget is all about borrowing. You have external borrowing, which is about 24%, and then you have domestic, which is at 14%. What I've seen is that For example, President Museveni came into power in 1986. Uganda's debt was around 1.4 billion US dollars. Today it has gone to over 20 billion US dollars. So the appetite and the addiction is clear. And that is that we'll continue borrowing as long as there is someone willing to lend the government. And I can assure you the lenders will always be there. Because some of these lenders are not even interested in the interest rate or the monetary side. They have their own interests, they have their own agendas. So that's where we are. We are now addicted to borrowing, and that's why, as a poor country, but with potential to be a developed country, we continue to live large. We need to practice fiscal discipline. We need to be rational. We need to look at, we need to look beyond today. Because this debt has devastating effects, not only on our generation, but even the next generations. I will tell you that this kind of borrowing is progressively unsecuring the future for the next generations.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. You have mentioned the keyword there, development, and I'll ask Richard, in terms of development, how is this domestic reliance on debt supposed to boost development? One argues that perhaps maybe increase the tax base. Then that way we can be able to finance our own budget rather than depend on the very same domestic to rely on to accumulate money to be able to finance the budget. Why don't we use other alternatives? So when it comes to this line that the Ministry of Finance is taking, is it developmental to us at the end of the day?
Yeah, it would be. It would be developmental. But then, first of all, it goes also back to what are you going to use the money for? Most of the money could be going to paying salaries.
Yeah.
So it is still developmental.
Paying salaries, extending public service to
actually
us the citizens.
Salaries only take about 5.5 trillion.
Yeah, because what we're faced right now, people are grappling with poor service delivery. I think that's the major thing here.
And I think poor service delivery might continue to remain an issue, irrespective of the money that we are borrowing, because if you also look at the performance of the current, the quarter two, we have just released the quarter two funds to the district, and you see the performance of the different grants that are sent out there. I think wage is already performing at around 56%, and at quarter two should be half the year, so it should be at around 50%. Then you look at domestic areas. For them that they are paying, they prioritize domestic areas, and they are already performing at around 100 and something already. But then when you look at the development component, it is performing below 50%, about 45%, which means that any cuts that occur within the budget affect the development component.
Yeah.
So when salaries increased, with the increase of salaries for the soldiers and for the teachers, the development component suffered is affected. So what does that tell us? That priority is given, and the first call to the budget is debt repayment, then salaries. So, which means that we are remaining with, now the balance that remains goes to the development component, however much is remaining. So when you look at it and you see where our priorities are, you might find that we might continue to grapple with service delivery.
We're still in this ditch for a while.
Yeah, for a while, but then also probably saying that we concentrate on more borrowing. He has talked about exercising fiscal discipline, and there are a number of things that the government could do actually to at least cut down its expenditure.
Okay, I'll come to those recommendations, but turning to you, Francis, it comes down to the priorities of the government.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do those priorities reflect the priorities of our country, Uganda, and its citizens? because ideally they should be the primary benefits or beneficiaries for the financial budget that we're talking about here. And so what's the actual priority? What should be the actual priority? And then locally, away from depending on domestic debt, what are the alternatives that we can look forward to in the future to adopt to, break away from the spirit of borrowing?
Thank you, Priscilla. When we talk of priorities, priorities are clear given your budget. And before we say what should be the priority, we need to know what is the priorities for the current government. When you look at this financial year's budget, you're going to see that 36% is for debt repayment in terms of interest and servicing these loans. We are talking about 36% of the national budget. Let's first forget about this standard that was put by actually these creditors about debt GDP ratio, that the threshold should be 50%. You can have that, and maybe you're even not hitting 50%. But if over 36% of your national budget is going for debt repayment, 36% at the expense of health, agriculture and education sector, then you know that it is no longer sustainable. And I'm talking about 36% of data. I haven't talked about domestic areas, which is at a tune of over 6 trillion shillings. So that tells you that the debt in this country is no longer sustainable. And this goes to the priorities, because after debt repayment, there comes governance and security. And this security is to do with the military, by the way. It's not to do with food security and other forms of security. That's why you have people dying of hunger in places like Kalamoja, and it is even spreading to the Teso region. You get, so the priorities, debt repayment. Let us keep addicted to debt. Let us look at debt as the main source of, revenue for the government. Then you come in with, our governance and security. And then you have human capital development coming in, which should actually be the first priority. So our priorities have been wrong from day one, and we need to arrange our priorities. He talked about recurrent expenditure. Recurrent expenditure, salaries only take 5.5 trillion shillings. It's actually 14 trillion that goes for non-salary and wages. So the priorities are completely wrong. The government tend to be looking at actually non-productive sectors at the expense of productive sectors.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Now, you have mentioned that you could have some recommendations that you can give our government in regards to this dependency now on domestic debts. How can we actually step away from this? And what are those recommendations?
Yeah. Probably I would say some of the things have been in the talks or in the works by government, but probably they have not come to fruition. One, there have been the talks around merging the different departments and agencies back to their
agencies and ministries.
Back to their mother ministries.
Let me be honest with you. I'm not understanding how we continuously have to have some roads and works under councils, and yet you do have UNRA, and then you do have a whole ministry there.
You also have Uganda Road Fund under that.
And you do have the Uganda Road Fund somewhere there.
Yeah. So there has been that. That would at least reduce on the cost that the government is taking. He has also talked about security. Security remains one of our biggest where most of our money is going. Yes, we need security, but do we need all that much? And probably, but we have also talked about mainly the expenditure by and this probably you don't say it so that loud, but the expenditure by State House. The continuous, its budget is big. So rationalizing and probably exercising fiscal discipline within the government, the cars that government is running,
right,
fuel and all that. So cutting, first of all, looking within the government, like for us, as we speak, when the prices went high, everyone in their family, they sat down and started re-strategizing and
from 3 spoons of sugar to 1 spoon of sugar.
Yeah, so government needs to look into that and reduce the cost. Then probably in the long run we need to look at, and there is also a strategy, an import substitution strategy, because currently we are net importer, and we have been grappling with inflation as a country. And the Bank of Uganda has continued to increase the CBR to counter the inflation, but then inflation has continued to rise. One of the reasons is that we are fighting imported inflation. What we are looking at is that the things that we are getting from outside countries, we are importing into the country, are already at a high cost, and as a result, that has an effect on the performance of our own here domestic currency and the exchange rate, and probably that also is affecting us. So how do we make sure that we import less and less? Because we look at things like onions. We're importing onions from Tanzania. Is Uganda supposed to be importing onions?
Yeah, our Nakasero market depends highly on fresh produce coming in from Kenya. So
there are things we are an agricultural country. So there are things we shouldn't still be importing. So we speak,
but again, as long as there's no priority to investment in agriculture, that cannot be the conversation.
So that remains also an issue. So, but those are things, the low-hanging fruits. We can pick on agriculture and say there are things we are saying we are no longer importing.
Okay.
And we are able to do that.
All right. So low-hanging fruits, Francis. What are those low-hanging fruits in terms of where government can actually put money to invest and expect good returns on it? And also, where is the low-hanging fruit in terms of tapping into increasing the tax base currently?
All right. That's a good one. But before I go there, I want to tell you that the government actually has exhausted all the alternatives where it can get the funding from.
Really?
The last one is when we actually got our special drawing rights from IMF. But it is important, we can talk about debt, its issues and all that, but it's always important to come up with the solutions, and that will take me to your question after that. I want to say that, borrowing doesn't have to be the main source of government revenue. First of all, what are we spending on? Look at as I told you, we're a poor country, but with potential to be actually a developed country. But our priorities are wrong, and we are not rational. I'll give you one thing, that when you look at the size of the government itself, it's huge. In terms of the size of the government, we compete with actually developed countries like South Korea and USA. We have over 170 MDAs. Those are ministries, departments, and agencies. All these take government's money. That's why, besides the salaries, we have the non-wage or non-salaries, which take over 15 trillion shillings. President Museveni, when he came into power in 1986, he realized that actually the government was big. So in 1999, he made a public sector reform. He reduced the cabinet size from 30 to 24. The size of the public service from 300 to 160,000. But now he has actually overshot it, So you have so many administrative units in this country, and all this comes at a cost. So one of the solutions is actually to have that public sector, reform, which is very key. And we don't have to continue looking at debt. Once we look at debt as the main source of revenue, then we are going to forget about the areas actually the government should be looking at. Look at the mining sector in this country. It only contributes 0.3% to GDP. And these are the areas we should be looking at. Formalize, come up with a well structure. When it comes to the mining sector, if you woke up with your gold, do you even know where to sell it from? Because it has...
They even get here.
You even don't know if you reach here.
That's be safe.
Exactly. So those are the avenues actually the government should be looking at. As a country, we have potential in the mining sector, in the tourism sector, but the mining sector has been left unstructured. I don't know whether it's intentional or by default, and is run by mafias, whether local and international.
They're going to tell you that now the confidence they have is that they have a satellite that's going to help them with mineral mapping. That way then they can start focusing on the mining sector.
They can never run out of excuses, that one I know. Yeah, but you know, the government should start, you know, should accept we are a poor country. Let us be rational and live as a poor country, but when we know that we have potential to be a developed country. Otherwise, we are going to be in this vicious circle of poverty. Because I want to tell you that the more you continue to borrow, yeah, the more you continue to kill your private sector. That's why in this financial budget, it was expected that actually over 52% of the funding is going to come from the taxman's, you know, payers' money. But they have realized it's not going to work because the taxes are not, the targets are not being met in terms of tax collection, and that's why now they are looking at more borrowing. But this more borrowing is going to actually kill further the private sector. So the government has to sit, pause, you know, change the way it is doing its business, and it should start by having a public sector reform. We don't need this whole government.
Okay, public sector reform.
And
then,
of course also corruption.
Yeah.
Because as I told you, there are two things that are progressively increasing in this country since 1986. Debt and corruption.
Okay.
They are moving in the same direction.
How can debt and corruption be altered for you, Richard, especially corruption, because I know that it's been reported more and more. And last week we had a story where the IGG was asking some members of a certain ministry to just return the money they stole. Nothing is done to the individuals, just return the money they stole. And that is how we're handling corruption in the public sector. So in regards to corruption, how can we deal away with it in order to then tame ourselves to be able to protect, finance accordingly and adequately the debt that we're accumulating?
Maybe to begin from the IGG part where you have talked about, the IGG does not have the mandate to probably execute a full-scale probably arrest of the people that are corrupt. And in most cases, when they come up with these, their reports, they are supposed to be discussed by Parliament, and then Parliament give recommendation, and then they go to court to recover that money. So the IGG can only audit and raise queries, which will in turn be discussed by Parliament, and then Parliament advises on further course of action. So they lack the enforcing power to make sure that probably they can enforce or persecute the defaulters. So probably that would be one point where to start from, that the IGG should be empowered to go just beyond auditing and raising comments, queries, but also to sanction the defaulters. But then also we saw the same thing with the parish development model money, where people started bringing it back and saying, I took this and it's here, and they are in office, going about business as usual. So, but one of the things that we need to do is that for corruption to be reduced or to be fought, it has to be handled with an iron hand. But then who is willing? Because where it is going, it looks like everyone is looking for something to take home. And as a result, there is, you meet the police, you're on the road, and they catch you. The military itself, they will even take the money from you. They will check your pocket first and give you your phone back and run after you. Probably if you are lucky, and they give the phone back to you. So I think the whole system, as we speak, is it is corrupt.
Yeah.
So it is an overhaul of the whole system. So which might not be actually an easy task, as from where how deep it has penetrated the system, and so fighting corruption remains an issue for this country, and probably we might not see it go away anytime soon.
All right.
In my opinion.
All right. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your submission to this conversation as we look to Uganda's debt and it being financed domestically. It has raised so many eyebrows, of course. One of them is the fact that debt and corruption are seemingly going hand in hand. One of the recommendations from the table is that at the end of the day, we will need an iron hand to kill corruption here in Uganda. But who's willing to front that iron hand? Who's willing to have that iron hand? The other recommendation that has come out is the fact that government needs to rethink their priorities, and on top of their priorities should be what is known as the human capital development. And until that is in place as a priority, we're going to be seeing misallocation of funds to what is supposed to be good service delivery enjoyable by citizens of Uganda. And of course, there's also consideration that perhaps we can go back to 1989, public sector reform. Public sector reform. It worked then, and it definitely caused tremendous enhancement in the economy.
Until politics overshadowed it. Perhaps today, if we can have a reconsideration of the public sector reform, it could go a long way in aiding a solution. So I guess at the end of the day, we're left with more questions than answers. What is the future of the country's economy as we head into the next financial year, 2023-2024? Well, we will find an answer.